Warning: this broadcast may contain content that some audiences could find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. Coming to you live from a cabin deep in the heart of the Canadian wilderness. Turn down the lights, get yourself a drink, and let's settle in for tonight's broadcast. Good evening, and welcome to Midnight Mysteries. Here are your hosts.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Midnight Mysteries. I'm your host, Nathan.
And I'm Mike.
Tonight, we're going to be talking about full moons. We're going to be talking about the scientific and paranormal link between full moons and legends around full moons and everything that follows. We're going to start off tonight by sharing a little fact. The word month actually comes from the root word of moon. A month was originally defined to be either 29 or 30 days, which followed the cycle of the lunar phases. Some of our calendar months were actually later padded with extra days so that the 12 months would make up one complete year, one complete solar year. Something that has an increased effect on the blooming effect of the paranormal and supernatural activity is the phases of the moon. When it comes to the supernatural and science, we believe that the blend between the two is sometimes very difficult to distinguish, and in some cases is impossible. We have to believe that the effect of the moon on humans is somewhere down the middle. This comes from the Journal of Emergency Medicine, 1991 to 1995. It says, to assess the moon's perceived impact on emergency medicine, a survey was conducted using a modified belief in lunar effect scale, BILE scale. 80% of the respondent emergency department nurses and 64% of the emergency physicians believe that the moon affects patients. Of these nurses, 92% find lunar shifts more stressful and indicated lunar pay differentials are warranted. Medical, social, and administrative strategies to deal with lunacy are presented. And lunacy actually comes from the word luna or lunar, which is moon.
Right.
At a purely biological level, a number of theories have been proposed to explain how the moon is able to influence us. It is commonly said that the water is the underlying link between physiology and the lunar cycle, the external grasp of the lunar effect. The logic goes that if the moon exerts a tidal force on bodies of water such as seas, then it will also exert a small force on water in our bodies, since they're mostly made up of water. Other theories' triggers include electromagnetic radiation, gravitational pull, positive ions, and polarization of lunar light. The lunar effect has been linked to the occurrence of homicides, suicides, fatal traffic accidents, aggravated assaults, and emergency room visits. In 2007, senior police officers in Brighton announced that research had found a correlation between violent crime and the full moon.
You know, it's interesting. I used to work on a crisis team where we would respond to calls 24/7 for people in different kinds of crisis. We experienced this on a very regular basis. Like you mentioned earlier, nurses, I can say police officers, EMS, and us on the crisis team, we noticed full moons, like whatever it was, it's like all the crazy stuff seemed to happen around those times.
Interesting.
And
Warning:
some of those
this
nights,
broadcast may contain content that some
come across
audiences
a
could find
EMS guy
disturbing.
at the same call
Listener
you're at,
discretion is
talk
advised.
about like, oh, it must be a full moon.
Right.
You hear people say that all the time. Oh, it must be a full moon. So I mean, whether that's subconsciously people are saying that because I've heard it before. Regardless, it's in our culture.
Right.
Whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
That full moons are you know, with full moons come weird behavior. Even our dogs, you know, our
Right. That's
animals,
true.
so,
Animals,
yeah.
There's a noticeable effect on animals. And
Mhm.
with that, going back to that, this correlates with what you were saying. The senior police officers in Brighton announced that research had found the correlation, and they plan to deploy more officers in response.
Right.
And similarly, rises in crime have been blamed on the full moon in Ohio, Kentucky, in New Zealand, even here in Canada. Justice Minister Annette King suggested in 2008 that a recent spate of stabbings might relate to the full moon. As scientists rushed to study the claims empirically, some early studies found a correlation between the occurrence of abnormal behavior and the lunar phase. There are some other much stranger things that have been linked to the lunar effect: absenteeism from work, alcoholism, electoral decisions, and sleepwalking. And of course, within the paranormal world, we're very familiar with the phases of the moon, from lycanthropy to the tangible feeling for the more sensitive among us, the feeling that says the veil is thinner than it normally is.
Well, you look at a lot of the satanic, like the actual satanic, not the. There's two different types of Satanism, but the really dark stuff, full moons, on almost every, or not, maybe not every, but maybe, just about every second full moon, there's some sort of ritual sacrifice of animals going on.
Right.
So, I mean, there's something to be said about that.
Now, when it comes to mythology, one of the popular pieces of folklore surrounding full moons is fey creatures. And there's a number of other large ones, but tonight we're going to center on this and then move from there to some really other freaky subjects. So let's start here in North America. Basically, when we've heard of fey creatures before, it usually references European mythology, European literature. You've got the Brothers Grimm fairy tales. You've got all of the old romanticism literature of the time. So basically, every First Nation tribe in North America has some sort of their own folklore and oral tradition with what translates broadly as little people or beings very similar to fairies. There are different names for these fairy creatures in every tribe, but they all share the same core characteristics. According to Laura Reddish, director of Native Languages of the Americas, these characteristics include dwelling in mountain caves, rocky places, the woods or near rivers. Other shared descriptors include these beings having formidable magical powers. Little people refers to the otherworldly beings that can often be known as tricksters, deceptive, and often violently malevolent in nature.
Deceiving.
Or something from the darkness,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Shadow creatures might fall into this category a bit, but the Cree tribe tells stories about the little people. Often both the Cree tribes and the white settlers warned newcomers against going to the mountains. They feared that the little people would come and take them away. These beliefs reflect other cultures that came to settle into North America later, specifically Alberta in this case. These include Norse Vikings and their beliefs in both the Fae and fairies, or more often referred to as meadow elves.
Never heard of the meadow elves.
Yeah, it's really interesting to look up. And in his book, A Handbook of Germanic Etymology, Vladimir Orel describes these elves as being specifically similar to those of the Native American legends and the Arthurian legends of old, including the description of these beings dancing in fairy rings. Generally, fairies are portrayed as friendly, magical beings in North American media, but in the rest of the world, the folklore surrounding them paints them in a much more terrifying light. One of the most common forms of tormenting families who have angered them is exacting vengeance by killing the children of a family. It doesn't really matter how slight the offense was. In the tale The Fairies' Revenge, a farmer builds his home on the land the fairies enjoy meeting and dancing on. The fairies destroy his livelihood and cause his child to die. The other history surrounding fairies talk about children being lured away from their parents, trapping people in their fairy rings, and making people disappear. In the book Toads and Toadstools, The Natural History, Folklore, and Cultural Oddities of a Strange Association by Adrian Morgan. Fairy rings were thought to mark the site of witches dancing on occultic nights, such as the full moon. Now, we'll come back to this a bit later. We really wish we could spend the next hour talking about fairy rings because there's so much to cover. But if you check out the Encyclopedia of Superstitions by Edwin Radford, Mona Augusta Radford, or the book from 1905 entitled, and ready for this, this is a really long name, Fairy Mythology, Illustrative of the Romance of Superstition of Various Countries by Thomas Catley.
Maybe before we move on, I'll talk about our first investigation of a fairy ring. We were made aware of one fairly close to us. Typical fairy rings that people talk about are like mushrooms in a circle, or even like stuff in grass, or but in this case it was large mature trees in like a perfect circle in the middle of a ravine. So we went there. We went to investigate on a bone/snow moon in February. Full moon. Usually there's some kind of occultic stuff going on that full moon. I think it was a super moon too, actually.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, we went there, trudged through the snow.
3 feet of snow.
3 feet of snow, thick forest. It was not a stroll in the park by any means. But we got there, and man, yeah, the atmosphere was strange.
Yeah. Felt very foreboding.
It did, yeah. And we started hearing weird things. Like, I remember you mentioned you heard what sounded like a bolt-action rifle.
Thought we were being haunted.
Yeah. Things were skitting around in the trees around us, but you couldn't see because the trees that made the circle were so thick.
Yeah.
You couldn't even really walk in there because it was ridiculously thick.
Yeah.
And it was a very strange night.
Yeah.
I remember leaving the circle and just kind of like, it's just, you could sense the atmosphere shift.
It was freaky. And just to add on to that, but Alberta is famous for its underbrush, but this was dense. It was
extremely
thick.
Dense, yeah. And then I believe it was the next day, a contact of ours who's an intercessor, she had mentioned that night while we were out there, she had seen some sort of creature chasing us.
Mm-hmm.
And then you showed her.
I don't even think she knew we were out in the bush.
No, right.
Yeah.
And then why don't you mention what you showed her?
She described this like emaciated being, very gaunt, and she felt like it was going to kill us and eat us, cannibalize us, essentially.
And then I believe you showed her a picture of a Wendigo.
Yeah.
She's like, that was it.
Yes. Yeah. And she was very emphatic about it. She pointed and said, "That's what I saw." Mm-hmm. And it was odd because the sounds we heard, we thought, is it birds? Is it squirrels? But it was pitch black. It was late at night. It just didn't make sense at all.
Yeah.
And that's a perfect segue. All of these legends depict fairy rings as places where men, women, and animals have disappeared, including having disappeared in front of large crowds and audiences. And if men, women, or children ever reappear, they had no memory of the time during their disappearance. And so for this next section, we're actually going to reference the February full moon that Mike talked about earlier. And like he said, the full moon in February is called the snow moon or the bone moon. And various tribes and white settlers around Canada and the United States reference this particular moon as the bone moon because it's when the winter food supply was beginning to wear thin. And people were often left to starve, or in some cases, some historical cases, they were driven to cannibalism.
Right. That's how long Canada's winters are, guys. Cannibalism.
6 months of the year, and then, 2 months of spring. And
that's right.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about Therianthropy. So on a broader scale, Therianthropy is the mythology surrounding the metamorphosis or transformation of humans into animals. This includes things like werewolves, sirens, mermaids, centaurs, minotaurs, etc. Now, a different circle of Therianthropy is a lot of New Age beliefs that believe people are born with animal spirits inside of them. And then there's the clinical Therianthropy, where somebody believes that they can shapeshift into an animal, but it's often the result of deep psychosis. But we're going to be talking about the Wendigo. Now, the Wendigo and Wendigo are two different beings. Basically, every First Nations people group has a different word for this being, but the primary two are Wendigo and Wendigo. Sightings have put them as close as Banff and Jasper, but can extend to as far as the Northwest Territories and Alaska. The Wendigo, a physical creature found in cold climates in Canada, specifically Alberta and in northern states like Minnesota. Ethnohistorian Nathan Carlson out of the University of Alberta says the Wendigo is often described as a creature with owl-like eyes, large claws, and an emaciated body. This horrifying being is said to live alone in the forest and feeds on human flesh. The Algonquin tribes called the Wendigo the spirit of lonely places, and they blamed many unsolved disappearances at the turn of the 20th century on Wendigo attacks. Basil H. Johnston, First Nations teacher and scholar from Ontario, describes the Wendigo as being gaunt to the point of emaciation. So its skin is stretched tight around its ribs. It looks like it's starving. Its complexion is an ash gray of death, is the way it's described, and its eyes are pushed back deep into their sockets. The Wendigo looked like a gaunt skeleton having recently come from the grave. Part of it is also described as its bones pushing out through the skin or against the skin.
You know what it kind of reminds me of? Chupacabra.
Chupacabra?
Yeah, I remember that one. I don't know if it was real or not, but there's that one video from Mexico.
Oh, yes.
Like, that's what I envisioned as
That thing's creepy.
As you were explaining that.
Yeah.
It looked like exactly
We
like
can
you were
put that up on
describing.
the screen.
We should,
Yeah. And with that, what lips it had were tattered and bloody, having been masticated by its own craving for flesh. So basically chewing its own lips off. In the Journal of American Society for Ethnohistory, volume 56, number 3, Carlson also talks about the spirit which is called Wendigo. In Algonquin literature, you could become possessed by the spirit if you consume human flesh. For instance, if you've used up your winter's food supply, like with the February full moon, and you have no other recourse but to consume human flesh. This correlates to our bone moon tie-in earlier. There's also the belief that one can be cursed or possessed by the Wendigo spirit, or the Wendigo is said to be able to possess someone if they dreamt of it, which is really interesting too. Often these dreams appear as a recently deceased loved one bringing you a bowl of human flesh to eat.
Okay.
The loved one in these dreams quickly reveals its true, terrifying, gaunt face when you refuse.
I mean, is anyone really tempted to actually eat that?
In their dreams? Yeah, like if one of our grandparents who has died shows up with a bowl of human flesh and they're like, look what I made you.
Go
Are
away.
you going to be yummy? Now, our focus is going to be on the possession of the Wendigo spirit rather than the physical Wendigo being. We're personally not convinced that they're two separate beings. In fact, I think we're both of the opinion that when someone gets possessed by this demonic spirit, which it really sounds like a demonic spirit, that their body can end up breaking down, deteriorating, and partially decomposed to the stress and other factors of, being possessed by a cannibalistic spirit.
Yeah, it makes me think, I mean, it's fairly common knowledge within, people that deal with demons and people in possession, or that are possessed by demons, that there can be some very strange physical things that happen
Effects,
to the person. Now, this isn't extreme cases, don't get me wrong. This isn't, everyone and their dogs.
Every
but-
possession.
Yeah. But even, I think of when it talks about Legion in the Bible, this is a guy who was possessed by many demons. It doesn't even number them, but many. And he's living in caves, in tombs.
Which is interesting because it talks about the Wendigo spirit, occupying lonely places.
Right. And so when you read here in the Bible, which is, an interesting thing to relate this to, but this man that was possessed by all these demons, he had super strength. It says he had been bound with shackles for the feet and with chains, and he tore apart the chains and broke the shackles into pieces, and no one was strong enough to subdue him. And then night and day he was constantly screaming and shrieking among the tombs and on the mountains, and cutting himself with sharp stones.
Yikes.
So imagine what this guy looks like. He's cutting himself. He's breaking things that no human should be able to break. He's screaming and shrieking night and day in these wilderness places, kind of like the Wendigo spirit.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting, the correlations there.
The similarities.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because there are dozens and dozens of reports in the early 20th century of Wendigo spirits possessing people in dozens of communities from northern Quebec to the Rockies.
Yeah.
In 1632, Jesuit missionaries that had moved to Canada from France to try and convert various Native American tribes wrote a field report that they would send to their board to update them on their journey. The report was called the Jesuit Relations and was written in French, Latin, and Italian. In 1661, the Jesuit Relations reported the following. What caused us greater concern was the intelligence that met us upon entering the lake, namely that the men deputized by our conductor, the men that were awaiting our coming, had met their death the previous winter in a very strange manner. Those poor men were seized by an ailment unknown to us, but not very unusual among the people we were seeking. They are afflicted with neither lunacy, hypochondria, nor frenzy, but have a combination of all these species of disease, which affects their imagination and causes them a more than canine hunger. This makes them so ravenous for human flesh that they pounce upon women, children, and even upon men, like furious and frenzied werewolves, and devour them voraciously without being able to appease or glut their appetite, ever seeking fresh prey, and the more greedily they eat, the more they're hungered for flesh. The ailment attacked our deputies, and they were slain in order to stay the course of their madness.
That's interesting and crazy, of course. That's completely crazy. But when you look at the difference in views from the Europeans and the North American natives, the Europeans call it werewolf or something like a werewolf, whereas the North Americans called it the Wendigo spirit. And it's interesting because when the Europeans came over, that's when Wendigo spirit started to be where people start to describe it as having antlers and looking like a stag.
Right.
When really that's not at all what it was described as before.
Right.
And so that was like taking their idea of werewolves and animals and humans combining into this monster.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting how that plays out in that story.
Yeah. And it's freaky because it says that the men that had been deputized, they're the ones that had grown this cannibalistic hunger.
Yeah.
And it surprised them, but it didn't surprise the people they were trying to evangelize, right? They seemed familiar with the affliction.
Yeah.
And they said these men were so crazed that they were like frenzied werewolves, right?
Yeah.
They were so starving. And it's interesting because we didn't talk about it, but in these Native American and First Nations legends, they talk about the spirit of Wendigo saying that, the more they eat, the hungrier they get.
Right.
And basically they're skeletons, right?
Yeah.
Even though they eat and consume a ton.
Crazy.
And eventually, as North American culture gradually gravitated and grew towards secularism and away from spiritualism, the term Wendigo possession became Wendigo-psychosis. One of the more famous cases of Wendigo-psychosis reportedly involved a Plains Cree trapper from Alberta named Swift Runner. In Ethnohistory, Volume 35, Number 4, there's a journal called The Wendigo in the Material World by Robert A. Brightman, University of Wisconsin. Brightman recounts one of the most gruesome murders Alberta has ever seen. In 1978, a man named Swift Runner and his family were starving, and his eldest son died. Swift Runner and his family were about a 6-hour walk from the emergency food supplies at Hudson Bay Company Post. Swift Runner butchered and ate his wife and 5 remaining children. Given that he resorted to cannibalism so near to food supplies, and that he killed and consumed the remains of all those present, it was revealed that Swift Runner's cannibalism was most likely not a last resort to avoid starvation, but rather a man with Wendigo-psychosis. He eventually confessed and was executed by authorities at Fort Saskatchewan. So what could Wendigo-psychosis look like today?
Yeah, there's a lot of actually stories in Alberta. I mean, some of them aren't exactly credible, and we don't know the degree of truth.
But we know that Swift Runner was a historical
that one's
event.
historical,
It's
but
tense.
Yeah. There's Fort Kent, Alberta. It's kind of up by Cold Lake. There's a lot of stories of Wendigo spirit in there, and the original story is almost unbelievable, which is why a lot of people say it's just a scary story. But a doctor who was there treating smallpox, he became overwhelmed by it, by all the things he was doing and the people dying, and then his wife got smallpox and died. And in his grief, he was enticed or overtaken by that Wendigo spirit, and he just went crazy, ate his wife, and like most of the town, like I'm talking like 80% of the town, like he just went crazy and killed them all, right?
Jeez.
And then there's kind of this ongoing legend in that town of grisly murders. So it's fairly widespread in Canada, different stories. I mean, again, I can't verify the truth of those, but as you said, the one that you mentioned is a true story.
What's really creepy is the fact that all of these stories contain the gluttony for human flesh. Like Swift Runner eating his wife and I think we said 6 kids.
5 kids.
One human heart is 7 pounds.
Yeah.
Like the fact that he consumed them. And even the story from the Jesuit priests in their report back, like, and even in the Fort Kent murders, it's just, it really does depict that frenzied, cannibalistic,
that insatiable
desire for human flesh. I mean, when you think about people snapping today, you think about them grisly killing their family.
Yeah.
You don't think about them going on a cannibal spree.
Right. Yeah.
It sounds like The Walking Dead or zombies.
It makes me think of, I can't remember what year it was, back when in Florida, that guy, I think he was on bath salts or something.
Oh, yeah.
When he had attacked that guy and started like eating his flesh.
Yeah.
Messed up.
And that's a perfect segue. We had left off on Wendigo-psychosis, and we're wondering what Wendigo-psychosis looks like today. And if you fast forward to July 30th, 2008, a man named Tim McLean boarded Greyhound bus 1170 bound for Winnipeg, Canada. He had been working a carnival in Alberta and was napping with his head against the window, exhausted after a long night out. At one point, a man named Vince Lee boarded the bus and eventually began stabbing McLean in the neck and chest. The bus pulled over and the passengers terrifyingly fled. For the next 4 hours, the passengers remained outside of the bus while Lee wreaked havoc inside.
Zulu L8.
L8, Zulu.
Yeah, be advised, they're using the car in the ditch right beside the den as a command post here. I've got Delta 1 and Alpha 4 is just getting geared up.
Copy that. We're probably about 5 minutes away. 5-10.
Copy that. Badger appears to be a 6 foot tall Asian male with short dark hair, black t-shirt, arm with a knife right now.
Copy. It appears he has 2 knives now.
Or just confirm that westbound traffic is now detoured. 40 Alpha 8. Badger is armed with a knife and a pair of scissors, and he's defiling the body at the front of the bus as we speak.
He's still inside the bus?
Yeah, he's right up front, right by the door.
Copy that. Door open or closed?
Door's closed and blocked with a PC.
Copy that. We're just going around the bypass now. Other units are following behind us.
Okay, be advised, he's got a pair of scissors with him. The knife is towards the front of the bus, I believe.
Zulu, Alpha 16. Stand by for Zulu. He's on the phone.
Zulu from Alpha 8. He's at the rear of the bus, hacking up the body.
Zulu, Delta 1.
Zulu Delta 1 at your leisure. Could you give me a shout?
Delta 1, Zulu, go.
Okay, Badger's at the back of the bus, hacking off pieces and eating it.
Lee had not only stabbed McLean, but he had decapitated him, carrying his severed head around the bus like a trophy and holding it up for the passengers outside to see.
Messed up.
They watched as Lee sat there eating the dismembered parts of McLean's body. In a paper entitled Beheading Aboard a Greyhound Bus, Security Politics, Bloodlust Justice, and the Mass Consumption of Criminalized Cannibalism, Dr. Heidi Rimke, PhD, an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Winnipeg, details that Vince Lee was not only dealing with an ordinary type of schizophrenia, but a specific mental illness called Wendigo-psychosis. After the police arrived and after a several-hour-long standoff, they arrested Lee. Parts of McLean's body were retrieved from the bus while his ears, nose, and tongue were found in Lee's pockets. McLean's eyes and heart were never found. They were believed to be eaten by Lee during his time on the bus.
Wow.
Lee complained about numerous voices that were telling him to kill McLean and consume his flesh. Now, before I continue, I just want to say that we believe in mental illness and that mental health is vitally important. However, we believe that both are physical and spiritual in nature. Mm-hmm. We don't believe everything dark and gloomy is some mystical attack, but we do believe that we live in a broken, dark world. And with that fallen world comes sickness, disease, and death. And this comes to something called the unified field theory, where we personally believe that all of the paranormal, all of the metaphysical, the physics in our world, the physics of astronomy, the physics between dimensions, all fall under a single umbrella. Whether you want to call it spiritualism or the metaphysical or the paranormal, we believe that it's all a unified field. We only found a few references with this specific case that point towards the Wendigo spirit. However, it reflects what we read about historically in terms of Wendigo-psychosis. From the frenzied violent butchering to the grotesque consumption, and not just the consumption of a few body parts, but the mass consumption of human flesh. Remembering the average human heart, like we said earlier, is 7 pounds, it's not a far or speculative reach to hypothesize that this case could be related to the other case studies we've gone over so far tonight. And with that, we're going to close tonight's podcast. We covered a bit about full moons, the science between full moons and strange activity. We covered one of the more common bits of folklore surrounding full moons, such as fae or fairies, and then from there into some of the more violent folklore or even case studies of Wendigo-psychosis or Wendigo as a demonic spirit.
It escalated quickly.
It did, and like we said, we could have spent hours going over the different factors concerning full moons, but we'll save that for a different night. For tonight's episode, I'm Nathan.
And I'm Mike.
Thanks for joining us. Have a good night.